Welcome to Folklore, a place where forgotten rituals still breathe, where bloodlines carry secrets, and where every village has a shadow it no longer dares to name. Here we do not invent horror, we dig it up. From ancient soil, from salt-stained stones, from whispers passed down like curses. Our stories are born from betrayed spirits, cursed rites, and sacred traditions broken by fear. They come from the old world, where the veil between the living and the dead was thin, and sometimes still is. Tonight, we begin a tale soaked in sea brine and sorrow, of hair sealed in glass, of jealous spirits clawing for a name, of a mother's lie and the tide that never retreated. This is not a ghost story. It is a warning. You are watching Folklore, and in this place, the past never stays buried. They say the sea keeps secrets, but in Rosilna, it returns them. The village sat clenched into the cliffside like a fist, its cobbled paths slick with moss, and every door swollen from the salt. Wind was a permanent resident, howling, sobbing, or humming, depending on the day. But on the evening the chapel bells rang for no reason, the air was utterly still. No breeze, no movement, only the distant toll of iron echoing across the water. The villagers heard it from their homes, their windows fogged and trembling. The elders crossed themselves without asking why. The children froze mid-play, and the women, especially the mothers, turned their heads toward the chapel, their faces hollowing with dread. Because everyone in Rosilna knew the bells only rang when something was taken. At the edge of the cliff, just before the slope curved into wild bramble, stood the chapel of Saint Mirina. Its stone walls were worn as if the sea had tried for centuries to claw it back. No one worshipped there anymore. Not truly. They performed the rites, the offerings, the tethering. But there were no sermons, no hymns, no God left to ask for help. Only tradition, passed down like a curse stitched into the skin. Beneath the chapel was the shrine, and beneath the shrine, a secret. That night, the secret stirred. Inside the home of Marja Venik, a mother sat at her kitchen table with her head in her hands. The hearth fire had long gone out. Her fingers were still streaked with blood from the cutting, but not her daughter's. The braid on the table was dark, too dark and coarse, not like Anna's soft flaxen curls. Marja stared at it as if willing it to change, to become something it was not. But the lie had already taken form, and the jar sat waiting. She hadn't meant for it to happen. Anna was supposed to be tethered tomorrow, on the eve of her 15th birthday, just like every girl before her, just like Marja had been, and her mother before that, and her grandmother before that. The ritual was simple, a single braid, cut at the nape, sealed in glass, and stored in the shrine. It was said to bind a girl's soul to the land, so that when the weeping wives came calling from the sea, they would find no name to claim. But Anna was gone, vanished the night before, and Marja, she had made a choice, one she could not take back. She had crept through the village in the hours before dawn, trembling with shame, and found the child of travelers, mute, unbraided, nameless to the village, a girl who would not be missed. She caught her hair with trembling hands, wrapped it in cloth, and prayed to a god she no longer believed in. Now the braid sat in the jar, sealed, cold, waiting to be placed among the others beneath the chapel. Outside, the fog crawled inland with unnatural speed. At the edge of the village, old Darya Petrova stood on her porch with her lantern raised. She was the keeper of the shrine. Her back was bent like a question mark, and her eyes had long since turned a milky gray, but she saw everything, especially the things people wished to keep hidden. The bells rang again. Darya's hand trembled. She whispered, "Someone broke the binding." No one answered her. Only the sea replied, groaning low against the cliffside like something waking up. Elsewhere in the homes of other daughters awaiting their tethering, strange things began to happen. One girl awoke screaming, her pillow soaked in cold salt water. Another found a long black hair coiled beneath her tongue. A third stood paralyzed in her hallway, watching as her braid lifted behind her, suspended in still air as if being held by unseen hands. And in the shrine below the chapel, the oldest jars began to vibrate. Thin cracks formed, hair turned brittle, names began to blur on the labels written generations ago. But worst of all was the sound, a soft, wet scraping, as if nails were being dragged along the inside of the glass. Marja did not sleep that night. She sat beside her door with a lantern and a knife, the jar in her lap, her ears tuned to every creak of the wood. The fire would not relight. The salt refused to stay in the bowl by the window, and the wind, when it returned, smelled like something dead. And beneath all of it, just beneath the edge of silence, she heard it, a voice. Faint, feminine, young but ancient, whispering from within the jar. Not Anna's voice, not anyone's voice she knew. Just one question, over and over and over again. Whose braid is this? There was no path to the shrine, only memory and fear. The entrance lay hidden beneath the stone slab inside the chapel's nave, wedged between two pews warped with salt. It could not be opened without permission from the keeper, and the keeper never slept. By dawn, mist blanketed Rasilna like a burial shroud. Villagers moved slower that morning. The fog was too thick. The bells had rung, and the sea had not retreated. Old Darya Petrov unlocked the chapel doors with hands that shook harder than usual. The iron key was warm when it should have been cold. She stared at it for a moment before turning the lock, listening to the groan of the hinges as the chapel sighed open. Inside, the pews faced the altar, but no one prayed there anymore. Not since the drownings, not since the weeping. The only holy object was the slab, carved with the ancient emblem of the spiral braid. It marked the descent into the shrine, where every girl's soul was anchored in glass. Darya lit a lantern. The flame hissed, struggling to stay alive in the damp air. She stepped forward and pressed both palms to the slab. A whisper passed her lips, an old word, half curse, half prayer. The stone slid aside. Stairs led down into blackness. The walls were slick with condensation, and the air stank of mildew and old salt. But deeper in, there was another smell, faint, sickly sweet, like dried seaweed rotting under heat. She reached the bottom and turned. There it was, The Shrine of Tethers. A room carved directly into the cliff, its walls lined with narrow shelves that trembled slightly, even with no wind. Each shelf held dozens, hundreds of glass jars, some clean, others crusted with age. Inside each one, a braid, tight, neat, bound with string. And on each jar, a name: Anna, Mira, Elka, Yulia, Tamara, Isolda. Daria walked slowly between the shelves, her lantern casting uneven light across the rows. The jars were humming, a faint, almost imperceptible vibration. She narrowed her eyes. In the corner sat the newest additions, girls who had been tethered in the last few months. The glass looked untouched, still, silent. But as she turned toward the older section, her breath caught. A jar had cracked. It sat askew, the braid draying at the ends. The name had faded, the ink smeared as if water had seeped beneath the label. The string was loose, unraveled, and from inside the jar came a soft sound. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Daria leaned closer, her lantern trembling. "Don't do this, not again," she whispered, voice cracking. Behind her, a second jar cracked. The sound was sharp, glass popping under invisible pressure. Then a third, a fourth, and somewhere behind the walls, water began to drip, steady, like a metronome keeping time for the dead. She turned quickly, ascending the stairs faster than her old bones allowed. At the top, she slammed the slab shut with a grunt, sealing the shrine again. But even through the stone, she could hear it now. Not dripping, not scratching, whispers. A room full of jars, speaking in voices they were never meant to use. That afternoon, the village gathered. It was rare to summon the whole of Rosilna, but the bells had rung without wind, and that meant tradition had been broken. In the square near the chapel, families stood shoulder to shoulder, bundled in shawls and suspicion. Maria Venik stood among them, her eyes hollow from sleeplessness. The jar was already delivered. She had placed it on the shelf just hours before, beneath Daria's watch. No questions had been asked, no names had been spoken, but she could feel it, a lie in the air, curling around her like smoke. Beside her, the other mothers clutched their daughters tightly. A girl named Toma was pale and silent. Her eyes stayed fixed on the chapel door. Another girl, Lira, kept scratching at her neck, whispering that her braid felt too tight. And Yana, the baker's daughter, swore she heard her jar humming when she passed the shrine 2 nights ago. The keeper finally emerged from the chapel. Her eyes, though faded, were sharp as sea glass. She said, "Someone has placed a false braid. No greeting, no ceremony, only truth." Gasps rose from the crowd like gulls started into flight. She continued, "The spirit bound to it was not born of Rosilna. It does not know our name, it does not know our sea, and it is angry." No one moved. No girl will be tethered until the right is repaired, until the soul claimed by the braid is named, or until it names itself. Maria felt every eye slide toward her, then away just as quickly. No one would dare accuse, but everyone wondered. That night, the sea refused to sleep. Waves slammed the cliff like fists. The chapel shook on its foundation, and in dozens of homes, young girls woke gasping, hair soaked, hearts pounding, a taste of salt in their mouths. The shrine was sealed, but the voices had already slipped free. Toma Pavlenko woke in the dark, choking on seawater. Not a wave, not a dream, but real, briny water that filled her mouth and ran from her nose as she sat up gasping, her bedsheets clinging to her skin like kelp. She coughed so hard her chest rattled, eyes burning with the sting of salt. Her fingers trembled as she touched her scalp. Her braid was soaked, dripping cold onto her nightgown, as if she had been dragged under water. "Toma?" her mother called from the next room, footsteps rushing toward her. "What is it? What's wrong?" But Toma couldn't answer. She only pointed to the wet marks on the bed, the puddle that should not have been there. Her mother froze. Then, slowly, she reached out and touched the braid. It was ice cold. Her hand withdrew instantly, as if burned. The next morning, no one spoke of it. In Rosilna, silence was safer than curiosity. If you questioned the rules, they snapped back like hooks. So Toma's mother stoked the fire higher. She boiled water for tea. She braided her daughter's hair tighter than before and whispered, "It's just the sea air, darling. It seeps in sometimes." But it wasn't just the sea air. It was the voices. All across the village, girls began to hear them. Faint, muted, but unmistakable. Whispers beneath the floorboards, echoes in the basin, muffled cries when combing their hair. One girl heard hers while washing her hands and fled the room screaming. Another said her reflection mouthed something different from what she was saying. And each time, the braid would feel heavier, as if someone else was holding it. In the village schoolhouse, lessons continued as if nothing had changed. The teacher, a stern woman named Mirin Olva, wrote equations on the chalkboard with trembling hands while glancing too often at the girls' heads. 10 girls in the room, 10 braids, 10 jars in the shrine, but only 9 belonged. Toma sat between Lira and Yana, trying to focus on the shapes on the board, but her mind was elsewhere. Her scalp itched, not like lice, not like dirt, but like needles dancing just beneath the skin. When she reached up to scratch, her hand froze. There, at the base of her braid, wet again. She pulled her hand back. Her fingers were shining. "Did you go swimming?" Lira whispered. "No," Toma hissed. The teacher turned. "Quiet." But Toma's eyes didn't leave her hand, and she realized something that made her blood turn cold. The salt water wasn't dripping down from her hair. It was seeping upward from the base of her spine. That night, Marya Venik lit every candle in the house. Shadows still lingered in the corners, curling like fingers just beyond the light. She hadn't spoken to anyone since the village gathering, not even the other mothers, not even Darya. She didn't dare, because the jar was already in the shrine, and it was not Anna's. She sat by the window with her lantern, watching the fog drift in like breath from a sleeping giant. The sea had not gone out in days. The fish left in the market were bloated and discolored, rotting before they could be gutted. Worse, the wind had changed. It didn't howl anymore. It whispered. And sometimes, it called her name. Marya turned sharply from the window and gasped. The jar! It was on the floor. She had left it in the shrine, locked behind stone. But now here it was, at her feet, cold, whole, and humming. Her hands shook as she picked it up. Inside, the braid was wet, the string unraveling. The hair swayed slightly even though the glass was sealed. She stepped back. A voice filled the room. Not loud, not angry, just there, in her ear, in the walls, in her bones. "You gave me no name." Then the jar cracked. Elsewhere in the village, the keeper lit her incense and began the old chants, but the words no longer worked.
The air grew heavier with every hour. The chapel doors creaked at midnight, even when bolted shut. Girls stopped sleeping. They began to share dreams, visions of a woman standing at the edge of the sea, hair black and matted, eyes white and unblinking, holding a jar that dripped blood instead of water. Some woke screaming. Some woke speaking in languages they had never learned. One woke bawled, and the bells began to ring again. 3 times. Even the oldest villagers didn't know what that meant. But Darya did. She closed the chapel doors, pressed her back to the cold wood, and whispered, "It's inside the village now."
The jar should have never made it out of the shrine. Marja Venik knew this, and yet there it was, on her kitchen table, cracked, humming softly, and leaking brine onto the wood. She stared at it as if it might vanish again, as if admitting it was real would make her betrayal permanent. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it. Inside, the braid swirled unnaturally, like something alive. The ends were stiff, already beginning to rot. She whispered, "You weren't supposed to follow me." But the jar did not respond. The voice did, faint, curling beneath the surface of sound. A girl's voice, one Marja did not recognize. "You gave me her place, but not her name. I remember drowning. I remember the braid, but I don't remember who I was." Marja dropped the jar. It didn't break. It simply rolled to a stop, like it had chosen where to sit. Far across the village, inside a small thatched home near the cliffs, Darya Petrov lit a lantern and began writing. Her hands ached, her sight was dim, but her memory was still sharp. She wrote names of the girls tethered over the last 5 decades. She checked each one against her logbook, lips moving in a rhythm older than speech. All matched, all but one. Anna Venik. Her braid had been placed, yes. The label was neat. The handwriting matched Marja's, but something didn't sit right. Darya closed the book and sat back. No light in Marja's house for 2 nights. No smoke from the chimney. No visits. And worst of all, no prayers. That was how you knew. Not by screams, not by cries, but by the silence. It filled the gaps left behind by guilt and shame and curses newly born. Darya whispered to the shadows, "You never let lies sleep, do you?" And the shadows answered her with wind, inside the room, with no open window. Meanwhile, Toma stood before her mother with unwashed hair. "I won't let you braid it again," she said. Her voice was low, shaking. Her mother's eyes were wide with disbelief. "That's nonsense. You have to be braided. It protects you." Toma shook her head. "From what? From ghosts? From tradition? From the thing knocking on my window every night?" Silence. Then, "You've heard it too." Her mother didn't ask what. She didn't pretend to misunderstand. Toma nodded slowly. "She wants her braid back, but she says it's not hers and that we stole it." The room grew colder. Her mother moved toward her, reached for the comb. Toma stepped back. "No, I want to know what's in that jar. I want to see it." The mother's face drained of color. "We never look." "I need to." That night, Toma crept out through the back door while her mother slept. The village was silent. Even the waves had quieted, as if holding their breath. She walked toward the chapel. The key, she knew, was hidden in the lantern hook outside the keeper's door. Every girl had passed it during their own tethering, too nervous to remember.
But Toma remembered. She always remembered things that felt wrong. She took the key. The chapel door opened with a sigh, the scent of old wood and mildew pouring out like a warning. She stepped inside and moved toward the stone slab. The markings pulsed faintly in the lantern light. Her fingers brushed the braid-carved spiral. The slab shuddered, then shifted. The stairway below welcomed her with darkness. The shrine was colder than she expected. Not dead cold, damp cold, like breath on the back of her neck. She descended slowly, lantern held high, eyes wide open, and then she saw them. The jars, thousands of them, lining the walls in tight rows, each one humming, each one watching. Toma walked between the shelves, eyes scanning the labels. She found hers, Toma Pavlenko, tethered, year 317. The braid was inside, but it looked wrong, too thick, too dark, the ends frayed like rope dragged across stone. She reached out, and as her fingers touched the glass, the voice came. "You're not me. I'm not you. They gave me your place. Do you want it back?" Toma jerked away. The jar cracked. Down the row, others began to shudder. She turned, ran, heart pounding, lantern swinging wildly. As she reached the stairs, she heard them behind her, dozens of whispers chanting names that weren't theirs. She sealed the slab and stumbled out into the chapel, panting. Above her, the bells began to ring again, but this time, they didn't sound like metal. They sounded like screams.
The villagers of Rosilna had lived by the sea for generations. They knew its moods, they feared its voice, but they trusted its rhythm. High tide, low tide, pull in, pull out, like breath. But on the morning after the bells screamed through the dark, the villagers stepped outside to find the ocean had stopped breathing. The tide had not receded. It clung to the edge of the cliffs like a wound refusing to close. Boats that should have been resting on wet sand still bobbed in place, tethered to poles now half submerged. Nets full of yesterday's catch floated oddly, bloated fish drifting belly up in the water like drowned eyes. The elders gathered first, standing silently at the overlook. "The sea isn't moving," someone whispered. "It's watching," said another. Children weren't allowed near the shore that day. The mothers kept them inside, fastening windows, sprinkling salt, muttering broken prayers they hadn't used in years. It felt like the old days again, when ghosts were close and the earth knew it. Inside her cottage, Marja Venik stood at her sink, staring out toward the sea. Her hands were raw from scrubbing, though nothing ever felt clean. The jar still sat on her table, sealed again, but a thin crack had begun to spiral up one side like a growing vine. She could hear it, even when she left the room. A soft whisper, a soft wanting. Sometimes it asked, "Where is she?" Other times, "Who am I?" But more often now, it simply repeated one thing: "Let me out." In the center of the village, Darya Petrov rang the chapel bell by hand. The mechanical system had failed overnight. Ropes frayed, pulleys jammed. She suspected it wasn't a matter of rust, but resistance. The building itself no longer wanted to call out, but tradition demanded it. And Darya had one task left before her bones would be allowed to rest. She placed a call for all mothers to bring their daughters to the chapel steps by sundown. No exceptions. The ritual had broken, yes, but if the line was not repaired soon, there would be no line left at all. At sunset, the girls arrived, 10 of them, ranging in age from 11 to 16.
All had been tethered within the last 2 years. All had woken at least once with salt in their hair. They sat on the stone steps, side by side, while the mothers stood behind them like sentinels. No one spoke. The air smelled of copper and seaweed. Darya appeared at the top of the stairs, her shawl clinging to her like smoke. "One of you does not belong," she said simply. The girls did not move. She pointed to the chapel. "You will go inside one at a time. Sit before the altar, place your braid in your lap, and wait. If it is yours, it will remain still." "What if it's not ours?" Yana asked, her voice trembling. Darya's voice was stone. "Then it will try to leave." Toma was the third to enter. She stepped through the doors slowly, the wooden floor groaning under her weight. The air was heavier now and colder, thick with unseen things. She approached the altar, sat, unbraided her hair carefully, and coiled the braid in her lap. Nothing happened. At first. Then, her braid twitched. She froze. It moved again, curled at the end like a snake tasting the air, then tried to slither off her legs. She clamped her hands down on it, and suddenly a voice filled her skull, not from the room, but from inside her bones. "I didn't drown for this." She screamed. The doors flew open. Darya rushed in, her lantern swinging wildly. "What did it say?" she demanded. But Toma could only sob, her hands clenched in her lap, holding down something that was no longer just hair. By nightfall, 4 more girls reported movement. One claimed her braid tried to choke her. Another said she saw fingers at the end of it. A third didn't make it inside at all. She collapsed on the chapel steps, bleeding from the scalp, her braid ripped from her head entirely by invisible hands. The village panicked. Fathers began nailing doors shut. Salt was poured in thick lines across thresholds. Girls were not left alone, not even to sleep. Still, the jars in the shrine continued to hum. The cracks deepened. The air felt electric, like a storm that never came. And the sea stayed. It no longer roared. It pulsed, like a heart that didn't beat for them anymore. Back in her home, Marja stared at Anna's empty room. It hadn't changed. The bed still made, the shoes still by the door. Only now, there were footprints. Wet, bare, leading from the bed to the mirror. She stepped into the room, her knees nearly gave. In the mirror was Anna, pale, dripping, hair unbraided, eyes gone white. She mouthed something, but it wasn't Mother. It was, "She's not me." Then the mirror cracked, and behind Marja, the jar shattered on the floor.
In Rosilna, jars were never supposed to speak. They were meant to preserve, to contain, to tether a girl's spirit to the land, quiet, sacred and sealed. For generations they had done exactly that. Never once had a jar opened on its own. Never once had a voice escaped. Until now. The morning after the mirror shattered in Marja's house, villagers found broken glass on their thresholds. Thin strands of hair curled in corners like insects trying to hide. The bells did not ring that day, but the air carried a vibration, too low to hear, but impossible to ignore. It lived behind your eyes, pressed against your teeth, breathed through your hair, and it whispered everywhere. In basins, in teacups, in glass windows, in the oil lamps before they were lit.
1,000 voices saying 1,000 nothings, but one word repeated in every house: return. Toma hadn't slept. Not since the braid moved in her lap. Not since the thing inside it spoke. She now kept her hair in a tight bun, pinned down with bone combs and wrapped in cloth. But it didn't matter. At night she still woke with strands around her throat, coiled tight like a promise she didn't remember making. Her mother had stopped talking altogether. She only sat at the window, lips moving without sound, watching the sea that no longer left. Toma walked to the edge of the cliff that morning, alone, despite the warnings, and stared down at the waves. But there were no waves, only eyes, wide, pale, endless. Dozens of them bobbing just beneath the surface. She stumbled back, heart thundering, breath shallow. Behind her a voice spoke. "You shouldn't come here alone." It was Lyra, pale, too thin, braid wrapped around her neck like a scarf. Her eyes were red from crying. "They're waking up," Lyra said softly. "The ones in the jars. They're not just voices anymore." Toma whispered, "What do they want?" Lyra's lips trembled. "They want their names, or someone else's. They don't care which." In the shrine, Darya lit 3 more candles. The darkness seemed thicker now, more resistant to light. She could feel the cold leaking from the jars, not like temperature, but like grief, sharp and endless, as if the room itself was mourning something long buried and suddenly remembered. She stepped carefully down the aisles. 7 jars had cracked, 3 had broken, and 2 were missing. That had never happened before. She knelt beside one jar with a shattered lid. The braid had withered, blackened at the ends. The label had peeled away completely, leaving no trace of who it had once belonged to. As she reached to lift the jar, her hand brushed the rim, and the whisper came, not a voice beside her, but within her skin. "Too late." She recoiled, then turned quickly. There, on the far wall, one jar was glowing. Not bright, not warm, but pulsing with a sickly pale light, like something inside was beating softly. She stepped closer. The name on the label had changed. It no longer read Anna Velenik. It now read, "Not hers." Marja wandered the market that day with her hood pulled low. She didn't speak to anyone, didn't stop to look at the wilted produce or the buckets of rotting fish. She only glanced over her shoulder again and again, as if expecting someone to follow. But no one did. No one had since the night she cut the stranger's braid. Still, she felt it, the weight, as if the braid had wound itself around her spine. She entered her home at dusk and found the door open. The wind had not done it. There was no wind anymore. Inside, the broken jar lay in pieces across the floor, but now there were 2 braids, one dark, one fair, twined together, and a word scrawled across the table in salt: "Name me." That night the girls met in secret, all of them, all 10. They gathered in the old bathhouse behind the chapel, a place where mothers no longer went and children never dared. They brought their mirrors, their combs, their fears, and they shared what they had been hearing. Voices that whispered in time with their breath, jars that moved, hair that unbraided itself at night, dreams of drowning in mirrors, not water. Yana's voice shook.
Mine said it was looking for someone to trade. Toma clenched her fists. We have to know which braid didn't belong. But we can't open the jars, another girl said. Lyra's voice was soft. We don't have to. They're already opening themselves. Somewhere beneath the village, in the deepest part of the cliff, an unmarked jar pulsed against its shelf. Hair twisted, water hissed inside. Cracks spidered outward in slow silence. And just before the candle beside it went out, a single whisper filled the shrine. I remember who I was.
The voice came to Toma just before dawn. Not in a dream, not from the sea, but from her mirror. She had risen in the dark, her skin damp with sweat, her braid undone without her knowing. As she moved toward the basin to splash cold water on her face, the mirror above it caught her eye. Her reflection was wrong. Same face, same eyes, same lips, but they were moving differently. She watched as her own mouth smiled, slow, unfamiliar, then whispered words she did not speak. I know you, Toma. I know who you were meant to be, but I was taken instead. Toma stepped back, her spine hit the wall. The reflection continued to speak, though her own lips stayed closed. Your name was meant for me, but they gave it to you. Return what's mine. The glass began to fog, not from heat, but from breath on the inside. And scrawled across that breath were 3 words, You are me. By morning, Toma hadn't spoken a word. She sat at the edge of her bed, her braid wrapped around her wrist like a tether, hands trembling. Her mother tried to coax her into tea, into bread, into silence, but Toma would not move. Until a knock came, not at the door, but at the window. A girl stood there, her face pale, her hair wild and tangled, dripping seawater down her shoulders. Toma stood slowly and opened the window. It was Lyra. I saw her, Lyra whispered. She said your name. Toma's voice cracked. In the mirror? Lyra shook her head. No, in my jar. The girls met again that night, this time inside the chapel itself. Darya had gone to rest. The bells had stopped ringing, but the shrine remained sealed beneath the stone. Toma, Lyra, and Yana stood before the altar, the flickering candlelight making their faces look older, more haunted. She spoke my name, Toma said softly. She said it belonged to her. She's picking us, testing who's weak, who'll break first. No, Lyra said. She's trying to remember. Remember what? Her own name. They fell into silence. Then Toma stepped forward and placed both hands on the altar. Its stone was colder than it should have been. I want to speak to her. That night, Toma returned to the mirror. She lit a single candle and placed it beside her. She stared into the glass for what felt like hours, waiting for something to change. At first, nothing. Then, movement. Her reflection blinked once, then leaned forward without her moving at all. The smile returned, and the voice was clearer now. I was the daughter of a widow. The sea took her, but not me. They gave me no name when I came ashore. Only a braid, only a jar, only silence. Toma whispered, Who are you? The reflection smiled wider, sadder. I was the braid that did not belong. You walk in the life that should have been mine.
Toma's hands gripped the edge of the table. "Then tell me your name!" The voice went still. Then, for the first time, it sounded afraid. "I can't! They buried it!" Across the village, jars began to hum louder. Windows rattled, lanterns flickered, doors refused to stay closed. A mother found her daughter floating inches above the bed, hair coiling toward the ceiling like smoke. Another discovered her family portrait slashed, her daughter's face scratched out. But no one called for help, because help had already stopped coming. Daria returned to the shrine at dawn. She found 4 jars shattered and a name etched into the stone beside them. Not written, carved. Velna. The air shifted. It was the first name to appear uninvited in over 200 years, and she recognized it. Velna was the name of a girl never tethered, a drifter's child, a lost soul, one taken by the sea during a storm long ago. No family, no braid, no jar. No one claimed her, so the village buried her in the old sandlot without a rite. But perhaps she had never stayed buried. Daria whispered to the shrine, "You remember now." The walls answered with a groan. The jars sang. Toma awoke with the name on her lips, Velna. It echoed in her chest like it had always been there, waiting. She rose slowly and walked to her mirror and said the name aloud. The reflection smiled, and this time so did she. Not in fear, but in understanding. She had never been haunted by a stranger. She had been sharing her body with someone who had been erased. And now that someone was waking up.
The women of Rosilna had always known more than they said. They spoke in warnings, not truths, in customs, not confessions. They passed fear down through lullabies and rules whispered over sleeping heads, but never the full story. Not until the jars began to sing. It started with the older mothers, those who remembered the last time the sea had misbehaved. They gathered behind closed doors, shawls pulled tight, mouths trembling. And in a room lit by oil and dread, they spoke the truth aloud for the first time in generations. Velna was real. Velna had been wronged, and her rage had not died with her body. Marya stood at the edge of the circle, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her eyes were hollow, bruised by sleepless nights and the whispers that never stopped. She had kept her secret for too long. "I put the wrong braid in," she said finally, her voice cracked. "I did it to protect my daughter, but Anna had already vanished." The room went silent. No one gasped, no one scolded, because deep down, they already knew. Marya swallowed hard. "I couldn't face the shame, so I found another girl, a quiet one, dark hair. I never asked her name." Another mother flinched. "You used a stranger?" Marya nodded. "She wasn't from here," said another. "That's why the sea didn't know how to hold her." "She wasn't named," someone else whispered. "She had no anchor." The words turned the air to stone. That was the truth behind the ritual, one never written down, only passed through blood and silence. The braid wasn't protection, it was identification, a spiritual fingerprint, a claim of existence. Without a name, without a braid, a girl lost to the sea would not sleep. She would wander. She would remember. And if someone else wore her place, she would return for it. The mothers made a pact that night. They would find the name, they would return it,
They would bury Velna properly, this time with honor. It was not forgiveness they sought, it was appeasement, because the jars were cracking, and the sea had not breathed in 7 days. At the same hour, Toma stood beneath the chapel window, listening to the windless silence. Velna had grown louder inside her. She no longer whispered, she shared thoughts, memories, images, salt-stung skin, a boat, a storm, a cold hand, letting go. She could feel them all, and somewhere deep in her chest, a sadness that wasn't hers. She pressed her palm to the stone. "What do you want?" she whispered. The voice inside her responded without hesitation. "A name, a braid, and a place that is mine." The next day, Darya emerged from the shrine with 3 broken jars and a revelation. There had been others, not just Velna, other unnamed girls, forgotten ones, strangers who had been lost to sea or shame. And over the centuries, the ritual had become more about hiding than honoring. "Do you see?" she cried to the mothers. "We've not been preserving, we've been stealing space from the dead." The wind rose for the first time in a week, but it did not feel like air. It felt like warning. In the village square, the girls stood together once more. Toma, Lira, Yana, and the others. They had all heard her by now. Velna's voice had touched each of them, some in dreams, some in mirrors. One girl claimed she heard Velna singing from inside the well. "She doesn't hate us," Toma said quietly. "She hates what was done to her." "She wants to belong," Lira added. "She wants to matter." "We can give her that," Toma said, "but we have to do it together." That night, the mothers and daughters gathered as one. The chapel was lit with every candle the village had. Jars were brought up from the shrine, especially the unclaimed, the unlabeled, the ones that hummed with forgotten grief. In the center of the altar, they placed one jar, empty, open, waiting. Then Maria stepped forward. She held something wrapped in linen, soft, delicate. Her daughter's real braid. She had found it days ago, hidden in Anna's drawer, tied with a blue ribbon. Somehow, she had known. She unwrapped it, tears in her throat. "I give this freely," she whispered, "to the one who was denied her place." And she placed the braid in the jar. A gust of wind tore through the chapel. Candles sputtered, shadows danced. Then, stillness. And from the jar came a sound no one expected. A breath. In. Out. Like the sea had just exhaled for the first time in a century. Across Rosilna, the tide began to retreat. The water pulled back from the cliff. The fish stopped floating. The bells rang once, softly, like a sigh. But the wind carried one final whisper. "Now I remember."
The village breathed again. For the first time in weeks, the sea had drawn back. The air was moving. Fires burned clean. Birds returned to the cliffs. And the girls, they slept. No salt water in their beds, no whispers in their mirrors, no braids moving on their own. It felt like a fever had broken, like the haunting had passed. But Darya knew better. It wasn't over. It had only begun to shift. She was in the shrine at sunrise, alone, her fingers trailing along the rows of glass jars that lined the damp stone walls.
Some were warm to the touch, others cold. A few now sat silent, their work, perhaps, finally complete. But many others, many were beginning to crack, not from pressure, not from heat, but from recognition. Hair inside twisted and twitched. Braids that had rested undisturbed for decades began to fray at the ends. Water gathered at the bottom of certain jars. Others held blood. And the names, that was the worst part. Some names had faded, others had been rewritten. Letters changed, identities blurred. One label had peeled back entirely to reveal two names written over one another. Darya steadied herself. We've buried too many lies. In the village square, Toma walked through the morning mist with a sense of weight behind her ribs, like Velna still lived there, coiled and quiet, not gone, just listening. But the voice had not returned since the braid was given. No more visions, no more words. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something remained unfinished. A braid, a name, and a place. That was what Velna had asked for. But not peace. Not yet. That afternoon, Marja entered the chapel alone. She knelt before the altar where the jar holding Anna's braid, Velna's braid, still sat. She hadn't dared touch it since the night of the mother's pact. But now, something about it had changed. The glass was different. Not cracked, not humming. Empty. She stepped closer. The braid was gone. Only a single hair remained curled at the bottom of the jar, like a question. She reached for it and froze. A sound from deep within the shrine below. Glass breaking over and over, hundreds of tiny shatters in the dark. She backed away, but the sound followed her home. By dusk, the village had begun to tremble again. Not from fear, from awakening. Windows rattled without wind. Mirrors fogged from the inside. Salt fell from shelves, clumping into words on the floor. And the jars, they sang, high and thin, a chorus of lost girls remembering their names. Yana's jar cracked that night. She heard it from her room, 3 short pops like bones under pressure. She ran to the shelf where it was kept and watched, paralyzed, as the braid inside slowly lifted into the air, suspended by threads of salt that shimmered like frost. A voice came, not Velna's, but her own, echoing in reverse. And then another, lower, older, unfamiliar. This name was borrowed. Return it or share it. The braid unraveled, and Yana screamed. The next day, 6 jars shattered. All belonged to girls who had vanished during past storms, girls no one remembered, girls who had never been buried. Toma stood with Darya in the shrine as they swept the shards, both of them silent, both of them listening to the low hum rising from the remaining jars. "What does it mean?" Toma asked. Darya's eyes were clouded but sure. "It means the others are waking." Toma frowned. "There were more like Velna?" Darya nodded slowly. "Many more, taken, forgotten, denied their names, their braids used without truth. Some jars were never theirs, some jars were filled with lies." "Then what do we do?" Darya met her eyes. "We let them speak." That night, The villagers gathered without being called. Men, women, children. They stood around the chapel like shadows, because the ground had begun to groan, and the jars beneath the cliff were cracking all at once. From the stone floor of the chapel came a sound like weeping, not human, not animal, but ancient, grief that had been sealed too long, regret given voice. The mother stepped forward, shoulders squared. We open the shrine, we invite them in, we let them name themselves. No priest? No priest, only memory. The stone slab slid open for the last time, and the cries from below rose into the rafters. The shrine glowed with the shimmer of shattering glass and unbraiding hair, and one by one, the names came back, whispered from lips that had never moved, written in salt across the floor, etched into mirrors, carved into doorways, chanted by the wind. Velna, Sira, Mayalis, Ilka, Nore, Ada. Each name lit a jar like a lantern. Each name brought peace or pain or presence. The girls of Rosilna stood among the broken glass and listened, because this time they weren't being haunted. They were being told the truth.
The sea had gone still again, but this time it wasn't holding its breath. It was listening. Listening to names long buried rise like mist through the village. Listening to stories whispered by hair that had been sealed too long. Listening to the weight of generations finally shift. And beneath the moonlight, Rosilna changed. That night, the girls of the village braided their hair differently. No longer tight and obedient, no longer knotted in fear. They let their strands fall loose at the crown. Let the moonlight catch the glint of salt woven in. Let the wind move through it. Toma stood by her window, comb in hand, brushing slowly. She didn't braid it at all. She let it fall, wild, wet at the tips. And in the glass of her mirror, she saw not just her own face, but a second one behind it, Velna. Eyes soft, mouth calm, hair blowing in a wind that didn't reach the room. "You remember now," Toma whispered. Velna nodded. "I do." The shrine had become a gathering place, not of ritual, of recovery. Each morning, Daria and the mothers brought new candles, not to chase out spirits, but to welcome them. Girls came with jars that vibrated, labels smudged, braids unraveling. They came with questions no one had ever let them ask, and the shrine answered. Sometimes in water, sometimes in cracks, sometimes in names written backward on the inside of the glass. One girl brought a jar her grandmother had passed down. No label, no string. The braid inside had grown thin and wiry, and when the candlelight struck it, it wept. From the braid itself, droplets of salt. "She was my sister," the grandmother whispered. "She died when we were girls, but we said she'd run away." The jar cracked, and a single word echoed across the stone walls. "Lena." The glass fell apart like ice under heat, and the candle nearest it flared, then calmed. Another soul had been returned. But peace was not universal. As the villagers honored names, some jars began to resist. Late one night, Yana woke to find her braid wrapped around her throat again, not choking, not pulling, simply resting there, as if warning her.
She stumbled to the chapel, clutching her jar. Daria met her at the door. "She said I took something, but I never did." Daria nodded solemnly. "Sometimes the lies aren't ours. Sometimes we carry what others buried." Together, they descended into the shrine. The moment they stepped inside, the jar in Yana's hands shattered, not from impact, but from memory. A name rose through the air in a scream that wasn't hers. "I was the first!" The walls trembled, the stone groaned, and dozens of other jars began to shake. Daria shouted, "To the floor! Get down!" But Yana stood her ground. She stepped into the center of the storm and opened her hands. "I'm not your enemy," she said, eyes wide. "I'm your witness." And just like that, the wind died, the jars calmed, and in the silence, a single braid rose into the air and gently untied itself. That night, the moon shone directly through the chapel window for the first time in months. It cast long silver beams across the altar, and in that light they saw them, the shadows of the forgotten, figures blurred and flickering, hair down, eyes closed, faces peaceful. They weren't there to haunt. They were there to say goodbye. Toma stood among them, her own hair brushing her spine like a memory that no longer hurt. Velna stood beside her, no longer inside, no longer a whisper, just a girl, restored, remembered. And as the moonlight touched her face, she spoke her last words. "You held me when no one else did." Toma nodded, tears stinging her eyes. "You gave me a name." By dawn, the last of the seaweed had cleared from the nets. The boats floated steady. The fish returned, whole and clean. And on every door in Rosilna, someone had written, not in chalk, not in paint, but in strands of hair, a single word: enough. The calm did not last. For every name that was found, another seemed to surface. Names no one had spoken, names not written in any book, names whispered from beneath the floorboards like water rising through cracks in stone. The shrine had grown louder again, not with rage, but with need. And in Rosalina, the quiet became sharp, too sharp. Marja was the first to smell it, a thick metallic rot that crept up from her floorboards in the early morning hours. At first she thought it was spoiled meat, but no meat wept salt water, no meat left black strands beneath the floor. She pried one board loose, and beneath it, nestled in the damp earth, was a braid, not her daughter's, not her own, coarse, mold-streaked, still moving. She screamed. When Daria arrived, the scent had filled the entire house. Several mothers gathered outside, covering their mouths, eyes wide. Daria did not speak. She fetched a jar, not for binding, but for removal. In 3 more homes that week, hidden braids were discovered, tucked in walls, sealed behind hearthstones, coiled beneath beds. Each one rotted, each one forgotten, each one never recorded in the shrine. Toma stood over one, her face pale. "How many do you think were hidden?" Daria didn't answer, because she didn't know, because the floor beneath Rosalina was no longer wood and earth, it was bone and hair and silence. The jars left in the shrine began to shift again. Now they pulsed at night, softly like lanterns behind fog. Some whispered, some sang, some simply wept. Yana said hers had stopped humming entirely until she slept. Then it would scream, a sound so sharp it cracked the glass on her nightstand. A name she didn't know, but her grandmother did. We lost a child before the ritual, before we knew what it meant. She was small, sick, and we told no one. Jana's braid began unraveling that same day. Velna did not return, not in Toma's dreams, not in the mirror. But her presence lingered. Toma began to hear other voices now, softer, uncertain. They would speak while she stood near the shrine. Some asked questions, some repeated names. One, very young, only said, "I'm cold." She sat near the entrance each evening, lighting a candle, listening. Sometimes she would whisper back, "I'm here." And sometimes the voice would answer, "That's all I ever wanted." One afternoon, the village held a burning, not of offerings, but of secrets. The mothers gathered in the square with small bundles wrapped in cloth, letters never sent, locks of hair never placed in jars, braids cut in silence and hidden in shame. One by one, they tossed them into the fire. The wind changed as they burned. It no longer smelled of salt or rot. It smelled like grief finally spoken. But even grief has a cost. That night, a girl named Sira went missing. Her jar had been empty, her name clear, her braid intact. But her shadow had begun walking a step behind her, eyes glowing faintly, braid undone. When her mother found the bed empty and the window open, there were only wet footprints left behind, leading toward the cliffs. And near the edge, carved into the dirt by a fingertip trembling with death, was one sentence, "I was never mine." Panic returned like a storm breaking the surface. The villagers demanded answers, asked why the jars weren't enough, why the names hadn't saved everyone. But Darya stood at the altar and told them the truth. Because some braids were given but never believed. Because some names were remembered but not honored. And because you thought the ritual ended with the cutting, but it only ever began there. Toma stood beside her. The braid around her neck no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a key. These spirits, they don't want to hurt us. They want us to feel what they felt. Unseen, unspoken, unheld. A silence settled over the crowd. Heavy, true. That night, as the tide rose to just past the usual line, one final message came, scratched into the walls of the shrine by something not made of hands. Not every braid was lost. Some were taken.
Toma no longer recognized her own reflection. The face was still hers, same eyes, same mouth, same line of a scar along her brow. But something behind the features had shifted. It stared back with too much memory, too much weight, too many names tucked behind a single stare. Because the mirrors in Rosilna had become more than glass. They were thresholds now, between what was seen and what was denied. It started with Jana. She'd stopped sleeping again, too afraid to close her eyes. She said her mirror whispered all night, not in words, but laughter, high, bitter, cruel. She tried to cover it. She tried to smash it. But when she lifted the cloth again, it had changed. The reflection didn't move. It only stared. Not like it wanted to replace her. Not like it hated her. It just looked disappointed. Toma stood before her own mirror in silence. The candle flickered beside her, casting her features in uneven light. She brushed her hair slowly, watching her reflection do the same. But then, it paused. Toma's hand moved.
The reflections did not. Her breath caught. The reflection blinked, once, deliberately, and then tilted its head in a motion that was not hers. Toma leaned closer. The candle blew out. In the dark, the reflection whispered, "You wear what was stolen." The next morning, 6 girls refused to look at mirrors at all. Not even puddles, not polished metal, not windows after rain, because something was living in the glass now, and it was not finished speaking. Darya moved through the homes, inspecting. She took notes on what the girls saw, what they heard. Some saw children. Some saw versions of themselves, but older, or rotting, or bald. One girl said the reflection smiled wider than her face could stretch. And another said it didn't have a mouth at all, just braids for lips. Marja found a face in her mirror she had not seen in 15 years, her mother's. Not how she looked when she died, how she looked the day she cut her braid and told her never to cry about it. The reflection mouthed one word, "Why?" Then the glass cracked from the inside. The village began covering their mirrors. By nightfall, every pane was veiled, but it didn't matter. The reflections found other ways to speak. In dreams, in water basins, in spoons and polished blades, even in the flicker of candlelight on window panes. Toma asked Darya what it meant. Darya answered with only 3 words, "They want truth." So the girls gathered again, this time without the mothers. 10 of them, sitting in the shrine by candlelight, their mirrors uncovered and placed in a ring around them. They had brought items tied to their lives, combs, ribbons, small bones, the first tooth lost, the last letter never sent. And they waited for something to speak. The air inside the shrine grew cold, not angry, intentional. Reflections shimmered, and then, one by one, they changed. Each girl now saw someone else. Not a stranger, not quite. A girl who might have been them if they'd been born forgotten. Toma's mirror held a girl with half a braid, lips stitched shut with string, eyes wide with memory. And behind her, hundreds more, layered, stacked, transparent but undeniable, a line of lives that had been cut short and then silenced. Some had been used, some had been ignored, but all of them had one thing in common. They were never claimed. The mirrors began to fog, words scrawled across the glass from the inside. "Name us, write us, speak us." Toma turned to the others. "We have to say them, out loud." Yana trembled. "But we don't know who they are." "They do," Toma said, "and they'll tell us, if we're willing to listen." So they did, all night. One girl whispered names into the flame. Another scribbled what she saw on the mirror in charcoal. And Toma? She pressed her forehead to the glass and said, "I will remember." By morning, the shrine was filled with echo, not of pain, but of recognition. And as the girls stepped outside into the early mist, something shifted beneath their feet. The ground no longer felt like soil. It felt like souls that had been waiting, and finally were heard. There had always been stories of them, of women who walked the shoreline at night, veils soaked in sea foam, eyes hollowed by betrayal, of widows dragged from their beds by waves that rose higher than any tide, of daughters who vanished on the eve of their tethering, never to be found except in whispered dreams,
and drowned lullabies. The old ones called them the weeping wives, ghosts of grief, spirits of the unnamed, not demons, not monsters, just women no one mourned. For years, the village had believed they were only stories until they returned. It happened first at the chapel. Yanona had stayed behind after a long night in the shrine, helping Darya sort what remained of the cracked jars. The candles were burning low. The air was thick with smoke and memory. Then she heard it. Soft, rhythmic, like feet dragging across wet stone. She turned, heart thudding. There, just outside the arched window, stood a woman. Tall, barefoot, wrapped in torn black silk that clung to her like second skin. Her hair was matted with salt, her mouth partly open as if mid-sob, but no sound came from her, only dripping. Yanona blinked, and the woman was gone, but the floor beneath her feet was wet, and the air smelled like funeral flowers left too long in water. By morning, there were more. 3 mothers saw them near the well, standing in silence, fingers combing invisible hair. A fisherman swore he saw a dozen figures walking across the surface of the sea just before dawn, and near the cliff, a child found footprints in the sand, walking out of the water. No one spoke aloud what they feared, but Toma said it first. "They're not here to take." Darya nodded. "They're here to be seen." That evening, every bell in the chapel rang once, on its own. No ropes, no hands, just a single cry from metal. It echoed across the water, and the air grew still. The girls gathered in the shrine again, this time with mirrors uncovered, jars open, candles placed in a wide circle around the room. Toma held a single braid in her hands, thin, brittle, old, one of the unclaimed. "She doesn't want vengeance," Toma said, her voice soft. "She wants what was denied to her." "A name?" Lyra asked. "No," Toma whispered, "a place." So they created one, an altar not of stone, but of acknowledgement. They laid each unbraided strand across velvet, placed every cracked jar in a ring, lit candles for girls who were never blessed, never buried, never loved aloud. Then they waited. The air shifted. The walls wept. And slowly, one by one, the weeping wives entered the shrine. Not in bodies, but in presence. The candles flickered. The hair on the girls' arms stood on end. The jars trembled, but did not break. And in the center of the room, the girls saw them. Shapes, faces, eyes that remembered everything. Toma stepped forward with her braid in hand. She did not speak a prayer. She only said a name. One whispered weeks ago in the dark. One lost beneath a mother's shame. One never written. Velna. A shadow stepped forward, and for the first time since the beginning of Rosilna, a weeping wife smiled. The other girls followed, one name, then another, and the room filled not with fear, but with recognition. Each shadow stepped toward its braid, its jar, its fragment of self. And as each was claimed, the air became lighter. The ground stopped weeping. The walls no longer whispered. When it was done, only one shadow remained. She stood at the back of the shrine, tall and still, face veiled. Toma stepped toward her.
"Who are you?" she asked gently. The woman lifted her head, but she had no mouth, only a braid, knotted, frayed, wrapped tight across where her lips should have been. Yanona gasped. "She was silenced," Darya whispered. She was never given the chance to speak. Toma reached out, hands trembling, and gently began to unravel the braid from the woman's face. And with each turn, each knot undone, a word formed, a name, Elira. The braid fell to the floor. The woman vanished, but the air smelled like summer, like a girl finally free. Outside, the sea exhaled, and for the first time in living memory, no one heard weeping in the wind.
The sea was quiet now, but the chapel was not. It creaked in the night, even when no wind touched it. Its stones sweated in the dark. Its walls whispered beneath candlelight. And at the heart of it all, something waited. Not malevolent, not monstrous, just buried. Because the chapel in Rosilna had always hidden more than faith. It had hidden memory, and memory, once woken, never goes back to sleep. Toma stood in the center of the nave, staring at the altar. The others had left after the ritual. The weeping wives had been seen, the names spoken, the jars stilled. But something still tugged at her, just beneath her ribs. Something unfinished. She turned slowly, eyes moving across the worn beams, the sagging pews, the water-stained ceiling. There, above the altar, a square of stone, duller than the rest, set into the wall, not the floor. She hadn't noticed it before. It pulsed faintly in the low candlelight. She stepped forward. Darga found her an hour later, kneeling beside the altar with her hands pressed to the wall. "You feel it too," Darya said. Toma nodded. "What is it?" The old woman hesitated, then exhaled. "It's what we were never meant to open." "Why?" "Because it was never sealed for us." That night, with the village asleep and the fog holding back the stars, they opened it. The square stone slid forward under Darya's hands with a soft groan. Behind it, darkness. Not like the shrine's damp breath. This was colder, older, still. Toma reached inside. Her fingers brushed fabric. She pulled it out carefully, cloth, wrapped tight, stiff with age. She unwrapped it, and inside was a jar. No braid, no name, just ash. Darya stumbled back, whispering, "It's her." "Who?" "The first." "The first what?" "The first girl denied the braid." The mothers had buried the truth long ago, before the ritual had a name, before the shrine had shelves, when Rosilna was just a scattering of cliffside homes and prayers screamed into the sea. There had been a girl, taken too young, no family, no name. And in the chaos of grief and fear, the villagers had burned her body and sealed her ashes behind the chapel wall, without a word, without a thread of hair, without a single soul to speak her into memory. She had no braid, no jar, no voice. Until now. Toma knelt beside the jar of ash and whispered, "I see you."
The wind rose, only inside the chapel. The candles flickered and bent, flames bowing in every direction. Then, movement. Ash lifted from the jar. Soft, gentle, like breath exhaled after centuries of silence. It formed into a shape, not full, not solid, but enough to see. A girl, thin, hairless, eyes hollow. She did not cry. She only opened her mouth, and no sound came out. Toma whispered again, "I hear you." The girl blinked, and a single strand of hair grew from her scalp. Long, black, straight. Toma reached into her own braid and plucked one strand. She tied it gently to the end of the girl's. "Now you're part of us." The girl smiled, then dissolved, softly, slowly into light. When the others returned in the morning, they found the jar shattered, but not broken. The ash was gone, and in its place, pressed into the stone behind the altar, were words. "Start with love, not with fear." That day, the shrine felt different. Not heavier, not darker, but emptied. The jars were still. The air was warm. The braids no longer writhed in sleep. And for the first time in Rosolna's history, no girl dreamed of drowning.
They began to appear one by one. At first, no one noticed. A girl with her hair loose, another without a ribbon, then one more, no braid at all. It wasn't rebellion, it wasn't laziness, it was change. A quiet shift, like spring arriving inside the body before the snow has melted. For generations, braids in Rosilna meant belonging. They meant safety. They meant silence. But now, for the first time, girls were stepping into the light unbraided. And still, nothing terrible happened. No jars cracked. No mirrors bled. No sea rose to claim them. Marja saw them from her window and felt her throat tighten. A girl no older than 12 walked cast with her hair unbound, curls tumbling free down her back. The mother beside her didn't scold. She only smiled, slow and uncertain, as if unsure whether she was proud or terrified. Another girl followed, then 3 more. By dusk, a dozen girls had walked the village without their braids. Some were shaking, some were crying, but none turned back. In the chapel, Darya stood before the empty altar, hands clasped tight. She had known this would come, had feared it and hoped for it in the same breath. Because the braid had never truly been about safety. It had been about control, about anchoring girls to a place that refused to hold their truth. And now, truth was untethered. She watched as Toma entered, her hair wild, eyes clear. "You're not afraid," Darya said. Toma shook her head. "I'm still part of this village. You don't need a braid to prove it? I never did." Darya's eyes glistened, and she whispered, "Then perhaps we've all been tying knots in the wrong place." The change wasn't only in the hair, it was in the voices. Girls who had once spoken only in soft answers now led village discussions. One stood before the shrine and told the names of every forgotten girl she'd heard in her dreams. Another led a procession down to the sea, not to beg for safety,
but to sing for those who never got to leave. They placed jars in the water, empty ones, clean and gleaming, not as prisons, but as offerings, a gesture of surrender, a promise not to forget. One night, Lyra stood in front of her mirror, freshly unbraided, and waited. No voice spoke back, no reflection twisted, only her, for the first time, unfiltered, unmimicked, real. She smiled. But not everyone accepted the change. There were mothers who tried to braid their daughters while they slept, fathers who muttered about bad luck and broken lines, elders who refused to speak of the new rites forming. They clung to the past like driftwood because it was easier than swimming. But even they couldn't deny what was happening. The sea hadn't taken anyone since the name Velna was spoken. The jars had stopped singing, and every girl who walked braidless woke dry. Still, the markings began, not on their bodies, but in the village. Symbols carved into doors, knots tied around trees, stones arranged in spirals near the edge of the cliffs. No one confessed to making them, but every girl knew what they were. Reminders, not of fear, but of what had been survived. The price paid for silence, the danger of forgetting. Marja carved her own mark behind the altar, a single braid, untied at both ends, and below it, 3 words etched into the stone: "Let her speak." That night, the sky above Hrosilna cleared. For the first time in memory, the stars reflected perfectly in the sea. No ripples, no haze, just the sky, mirrored, as if the world had been forgiven, or at last had forgiven itself.
Not every spirit returned with rage. Some came back softly, like the creak of a door no one touched, like footsteps through mist that left no prints, like the warmth on your shoulder when you're certain you're alone. And some never left at all. The jar had never cracked, had never hummed, had never asked for anything. It sat in the 3rd row of the shrine, far right shelf, covered in dust and time. Its braid was clean, the name still legible, but it was empty. No water, no hair movement, no sound, just silence. And when Darya finally reached for it, something in her stilled, because the label read Vera N, and Vera N was still alive. Tona held the jar in her lap that evening, the candlelight playing against the glass. She was tethered properly, cut on the right day, blessed with her name, her braid sealed in glass. Tona looked up. Then why is it empty? Darya hesitated. Because her soul was never placed there. You mean she escaped? No. Darya's voice dropped. I mean, she slipped through the ritual. They found Vera N the next morning, older now, bent with age, bones thin, mind quiet. She lived in the hills, alone, far from the water. When asked about her tethering, she blinked slowly and said, "They cut my braid, but I never gave them my name." Marja, standing nearby, gasped, "But the label!" "I gave them a name, just not mine." She smiled, and it was not soft. "I wanted to keep something for myself." The ritual had bound braids to names, but names are not always consent,
and Vera, clever and quiet, had withheld the final thread. So her body lived, her name was marked, but her soul drifted between, not dead, not claimed, just free. That night, the shrine was colder. The shelves groaned, the candles burned blue, and from the spot where Vera's jar had rested for 60 years came a single sound, breathing, but not shallow, not labored, steady, unbothered, at peace. Tona asked her days later if she was afraid. Vera shook her head. You can't be afraid of what you've chosen. But the spirits, I honored them, but I didn't belong to them. She leaned forward, voice low. Some of us were never meant to be sealed. The soul that slipped the jar became a story, then a song, then a new question whispered by the girls. Must I be contained to be remembered? And suddenly, the ritual no longer felt like protection. It felt like a door. Some still stepped through it. Others chose to stand outside and wave. And both were finally allowed to exist. The mothers began offering 2 paths, one with the braid, one with the name alone. And the shrine, once lined with rows of identical jars, now held jars of different kinds, some sealed, some open, some filled with feathers, or poems, or beads, because the spirit could live in hair, but it could also live in voice, in choice, in stories told by girls who would never be forgotten, not because they were preserved, but because they were heard. And Vera, she passed 3 weeks later, quietly in her sleep. When they found her, there was a smile on her lips and a braid in her hands, not hers, someone else's. No one knows whose, but the note beside her read, "She stayed with me. I gave her the name, and she gave me peace." That evening, Daria placed Vera's empty jar in the chapel window, not to contain her, but to catch the sun. And when it did, just for a moment, the dust inside lit up like stars.
It began with the water. The basins, once still, now shimmered at night. The surface rippled when no hands touched it. The scent of salt returned, subtle, sharp, familiar. And then the hair came back. Not in bundles, not in jars, just single strands, floating in the water, as if someone was bathing just before you arrived. Lyra was the first to see it. She leaned over her wash basin at dawn, expecting steam and quiet. Instead, she found one black strand curled like a question mark at the center of the bowl. She blinked, stepped back. It didn't move, but it didn't belong. Her own hair was golden. This strand was coarse, dark, sea-wet. She lifted it carefully between 2 fingers and whispered, "Are you someone?" The hair twitched. Soon, more girls reported the same. Basins filling overnight, water moving on its own, hair returning like old letters sent from somewhere far but not forgotten. No mirrors cracked, no jars broke, but the air grew expectant, as though the water had a message, a memory, a request. And the girls of Rosilna began to listen.
Toma filled her basin under moonlight. She said nothing. She left it untouched. And in the morning, she found 2 strands braided together, floating gently like they'd never been cut at all. One matched her own. The other she recognized. Velna's. Daria called a meeting in the chapel. "The water is speaking," she told them. "The ones we honored are not gone. They've simply chosen a new way to return." "They're not haunting us?" someone asked. Daria shook her head. "No, they're sharing space." The braid was once a tether. Now it was a conversation. The basin, a letter left on the sill, the strand, a signature. The mothers were unsure. Some poured the water out. Others began to keep it. They placed bowls beside their doors, under their beds, near their daughters' pillows, not as traps, not as protection, but as welcome. They waited. And sometimes the water bloomed. Tiny flecks of salt formed into patterns, words, names, not warnings, reminders. One girl woke to find a full braid floating in her bowl, wrapped in a red ribbon. She ran to her grandmother, who wept when she saw it. "She was my sister," she said, "taken by the sea before we had the ritual. I never said her name out loud again." "What was it?" the girl whispered. The old woman closed her eyes. "Anya." The water in the basin stilled, and the ribbon untied itself. Not all returns were soft. Some strands came tangled, knotted with weeds, marked with blood, threaded with shells or tiny teeth. These were stories unresolved, pain that had not been named, grief that had not been held. Toma began collecting these, not to fix them, but to hold them. She created a basin in the center of the shrine, wide, shallow, lined with obsidian. The girls called it the reflecting pool. They did not touch what floated there. They only read. And every now and then, someone would recognize a knot, a symbol, a strand, and whisper, "I'm sorry I left you behind." The spirits did not need vengeance anymore. They needed connection. And water, it seemed, was the perfect messenger. It cleansed, it remembered, it returned. That season, rain came early to Rosilna, but no one complained, because every basin filled to the brim, and inside each one a piece of someone waited, not to haunt, but to be held.
The first time Toma tasted it, she thought it was blood. Sharp, metallic, heavy on the tongue. But it wasn't. It was salt. Cold, familiar, and somehow intentional. She hadn't eaten anything, hadn't stepped near the sea, but when she opened her mouth to speak, the taste of brine was already there, settled behind her teeth like a memory too old to name. It clung to her words, coated her voice, turned every sentence into something older than language, something remembered. In the days that followed, others noticed the same. Girls whose voices trembled began to speak with certainty. Mothers who once muttered now sang when they spoke. Even the quiet ones, those who'd always hidden behind their braids, found that when they opened their mouths, the air bent differently, slower, softer, as if the sea itself was listening. Lyra recited a name during a morning gathering. Just one. A girl long thought to have run away. No grave, no jar, no braid.
The moment she spoke it, her lips turned pale and her throat tightened. Then relaxed, and the entire room smelled of ocean rain. No one questioned it. They just nodded. Because when the salt touches your tongue like that, you're not speaking the name. You're giving it back. Daria called it the cradling. When a spirit rests inside your words, the body may flinch, but the soul will remember. Is it safe? One mother asked. Daria's eyes glistened. What is safe about truth? Toma began keeping a journal, but not in ink. She dipped her fingers into seawater at dusk and wrote across a slate stone, letting each word vanish as it dried. The sentences weren't hers. They came through her. Some were memories, others were apologies, but most were requests. Let her sing. Don't rename me. Speak me into the morning. The salt water wasn't punishment. It was permission. The village began to understand. These weren't hauntings. They were borrowings. The spirits no longer needed jars or braids or glass. They needed breath. They needed the living voice. Toma wasn't the only one. Soon girls began waking with hoarse throats and heavy hearts, dreams forgotten, but the taste of salt lingering. Yana said her lullabies came back in another language. Lyra claimed her voice dropped into a deeper tone when she said certain names. One girl, Mira, lost her voice entirely for 3 days, only to return speaking in a dialect no one had heard in generations. She didn't know what she'd said, but a jar cracked in the shrine the moment she spoke, and a braid uncoiled itself, then vanished. They learned not to fear it. When the salt came, they paused. When the voice changed, they listened. And when the words weren't theirs, they didn't try to own them. They simply carried them. In the center of the village, a new altar was raised, not of stone or wood, but of voices. A circle where anyone could stand, speak, remember. Each girl took her turn, some trembling, some weeping, some smiling. They spoke names into the open air. They recited dreams. They whispered regrets. They sang lullabies no mother had ever taught them. And when the words were finished, when the air cleared and the sky stilled, the salt would rise, just slightly, on their lips. They didn't call it possession. They called it sharing, because the dead didn't want bodies. They only wanted to be heard, to be felt, to be said with love. That night, as Toma lay in bed, eyes wide open, she whispered one last name she hadn't dared to say. Not aloud. Not until now. Anna. Her sister, gone without warning, vanished before her tethering, swallowed by the lie that had started it all. She whispered it again and again, until her throat ached, until the salt came heavy, until the tears blurred her eyes and her voice fell into silence. Then, from within the quiet, a single voice answered. Thank you.
There was one name no one could find. Not in the shrine, not in the ash, not in the water, the mirrors, or the jars. She had never spoken, never screamed, never floated hair first into the dreams of the girls. She simply wasn't there.
but everyone felt her. The absence that pressed like hands around the heart. The shape of a story with no center. The braid that had never been cut. The one who was meant to be remembered, but wasn't. They called her the Quiet One, a placeholder name, a prayer, a promise. They didn't know if she had lived in Rosilna or drifted through it. They didn't know if she had drowned or disappeared. They only knew that every time they lit the candles, one flame flickered without wind. Every time they said the names, one echo never came back. And every time they gathered in the shrine, one jar seemed colder than the rest. Toma was the first to admit it aloud. "She's not just forgotten," she whispered to Daria. "She was erased." Daria nodded slowly, her hand resting on the shelf near the untouched jar. Erasure is more violent than death. It says, "You were never here to begin with." "But she was," Toma said. "We just didn't look." The girls began the search, not for a name, but for a presence. They moved through the village like wind, gathering clues from rotting pages, whispered half-memories, strange markings beneath floorboards, and ink faded in books too damp to keep. One girl found a scrap of ribbon sewn into the hem of an old dress. Another found a comb with no teeth, wrapped in gray string. And Lyra discovered a lullaby, unfinished, etched into the underside of a pew. They laid them in the center of the shrine, not offerings, not answers, just fragments. And they waited. That night, the wind changed. It didn't howl, it hummed, not around the chapel, but inside it. A sound like someone braiding hair in the dark, hands working slowly through damp strands. When they entered the shrine at dawn, one jar had moved. It wasn't cracked, it wasn't broken. It had simply slid, out of place, set apart, waiting. Toma approached it alone. There was no name on the label, no braid inside, just water, clear, still. And as she leaned close, her breath fogging the glass, a word appeared on the inner wall, scrawled in drifting salt, invisible until the moment she was ready to see it. One word: me. The girls gathered in silence. Daria lit a single candle and placed it near the jar. "She has no name," Yana whispered. "She doesn't need one," said Lyra. Toma shook her head. "She already told us who she is." They looked at her. Toma smiled. "She's the part of all of us that was never allowed to speak." They didn't try to label the jar again. They didn't try to seal it. Instead, they unbraided their own hair, strand by strand, and placed one piece each inside. 10 girls, 10 strands, floating together in water that now shimmered with memory. Not claiming her, but joining her, so she would never be alone again. That night, no one dreamed of ghosts, only of girls laughing in sunlit fields, hair loose, hands held, voices rising, not in warning, not in mourning, but in song. The next morning, the jar was gone. In its place, carved into the floor of the shrine, were 3 words: I am known. The ritual had once been law. A braid cut clean, a jar sealed tight, a name spoken in fear. It was meant to anchor, to protect, to preserve. But the truth had unraveled,
strand by strand. Now, in the village of Rosilna, the air no longer tasted of silence. The sea no longer pulled with grief, and the shrine no longer asked to be fed. Because the girls had learned something the old ways never taught. You don't have to be bound to be remembered. It began with the shelves. One by one, the mothers and daughters entered the shrine and removed the jars. Some they buried in the earth beneath the cliff. Some they burned with herbs and prayers, letting the smoke rise through the chapel roof. Others they placed into the sea, not as an offering, but as a release. There were no screams, no cracks, no retaliation, just stillness and peace. Toma held her own jar last. Her braid still floated inside, golden, quiet. She stared at it for a long time, her fingers curled gently around the glass. Then, without a word, she opened the lid. The water didn't spill, it shimmered. She reached in, took her braid, and let it fall free into her palm. It was colder than she remembered, lighter, almost weightless. She walked to the cliff and stood before the sea, then opened her hand. The braid drifted into the wind, and she whispered, "You don't own me anymore." The village gathered at sunset. No shrine, no altar, no walls between them and the sky. The youngest girl stood barefoot in the center of the field, her hair still uncut, wild with wind and wonder. When asked if she wanted to be tethered, she tilted her head. "To what?" she asked. The mothers smiled and said nothing, because they finally understood the braid was never what held them together. It was the voice. Daria passed that night, quietly, softly, in her sleep. They found her with a comb resting on her chest, her own braid gently unfurling beside her. She had lived long enough to see the story break open, to see the jars emptied, the names returned, the weeping stop. They buried her beneath the chapel, not in stone, not in glass, but beneath a tree. And on that tree, the girls carved the words, "She let us go." Toma remained by the sea for hours after the ceremony. The tide touched her toes. It was gentle now. No hunger, no grief, just movement. And in that rhythm, she felt them all. Velna, Ilira, the girl with no name, the sister she lost, not trapped, not tethered, free. Years passed. The shrine fell quiet, then empty. The jars that remained grew fogged, then faded, and eventually forgotten. But the girls, they remembered. Not with rituals, but with stories. They told them around fires, whispered them into lullabies, wove them into ribbons, tucked behind ears, passed like secrets. And so the memory lived on, not in glass, but in breath. And somewhere below, the waves, where silence used to bury all things unnamed, a voice rose through the dark, not to cry, not to haunt, just to say, "I am still here."